Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. I kindly ask you to take your seats, please. The 13th plenary meeting of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled, I quote, Letter dated 28th of February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136, end of quote. We continue with the debate. And the next speaker, I'd like to offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are grateful that we have been convened by this emergency special session of the General Assembly. However, we are deeply saddened by the occasion which compels us to meet. Once again, we are witnessing grave violations and abuses of human rights in Ukraine and against its inhabitants, perpetrated by the Russian Federation. Beyond the systematic violations and abuses committed by the Russian Federation against the people of Ukraine, today we are also meeting against the aggravating circumstance that is the recent illegitimate annexation of the regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, regions of Ukraine annexed by the Russian Federation on the basis of the fallacious premise of popular referenda. These acts of annexation lack any legal validity. At the same time, they constitute a grave violation of the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Moreover, these regrettable acts undermine the friendly relations and cooperation between states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Given that we must recall that no territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal, in accordance with Resolution 2625 of 1970, entitled Declaration on the Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations and Cooperation Among States in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, we are compelled to condemn in the strongest possible terms the recent attacks perpetrated by Russian forces against Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine, as well as the attacks against residential areas of Zaporizhia. These attacks continue to imperil the lives of inhabitants and their territory. It is of pivotal importance that the Security Council respond adequately to this growing threat, a threat which jeopardizes international peace and security continually. Mr. President, Guatemala did not hesitate in expressing its support for the Ukrainian people or in co-sponsoring the draft resolution under consideration entitled Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, Defending the Principles of the Charter of the United Nations. This resolution is contained in document ES/11. This resolution is not an appeal to constitute a multipolar world. Neither does it favor a unipolar world. It is an appeal rather to defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine and as such to defend the principles of the United Nations Charter. We have supported and co-sponsored this resolution on the basis of our own convictions as a country with a deep vocation for peace, we support this resolution, but we also do so as a state that recognises that through dialogue, negotiation and the peaceful means granted to us by international law, differences between states can be resolved. It is neither through force nor imposition that we will solve existing differences. The political constitution of Guatemala prioritizes contributing to peacekeeping and the maintenance of freedom. We also prioritize respect for and the defense of human rights, the strengthening of democratic processes and international institutions, which guarantee mutual and equitable benefits for all states. Mr. President, my delegation unequivocally reiterates the urgent need to put an end to this invasion and to search for a peaceful solution with absolute respect for the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, human rights and security of all. To conclude, I wish to echo the appeal issued by the President of the Republic of Guatemala, Dr. Alejandro Giammattei Falla, and I quote, let us opt for dialogue. Let us opt for resolving problems in the way that brothers do. It is now or never. Let us choose peace. Future generations and the preservation of the human species will thank us. Many thanks indeed.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guatemala, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Mr. President, in this hall in March, UN members overwhelmingly rejected Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And yet still, the Russian Federation continues its war of aggression. Ireland condemns, in the strongest possible terms, the attempts by the Russian Federation to illegally annex the Ukrainian regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. This is yet another blatant breach of the UN Charter by the Russian Federation in its war of aggression against Ukraine. Such annexation attempts have no validity under international law. Ireland condemns outright the holding of sham referenda by Russia and its proxies in Ukraine. These referenda were illegal and illegitimate. They violate the UN Charter, they violate Russia's obligations under international law, and they violate the law of occupation. Their results do not represent the freely expressed will of the people of these regions of Ukraine. Voters faced intimidation by the Russian military and by Russia's illegitimately appointed authorities in Ukraine's occupied territories. Ireland remains fully committed to the sovereignty, the independence, the unity and the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognised borders. Mr. President, let me be clear. No sham referenda or illegal annexation attempt will change Ukraine's borders. Not today, not ever. Mr. President, on the 29th of September, 10 members of the UN Security Council voted in favour of a resolution condemning Russia's illegal referendums and their illegal attempts to annex Ukrainian territory. This resolution only failed due to the Russian veto. It was a reprehensible attempt to excuse its own military aggression against Ukraine, a fellow member of our United Nations. No one country, no matter how big or powerful, should have the ability to veto the application of international law for its own aims. Ireland, and indeed many states present here today, have long called for the abolition of that veto. It is an anachronism, and today I reiterate that call. However, the use of the veto will not prevent the international community from responding to Russia's breaches of international law. It will not deter us from holding Russia accountable for its actions. In this regard, Ireland welcomes the submission of the special report as part of the veto initiative to this General Assembly. Mr. President, the latest indiscriminate attacks by Russia earlier this week on civilian populations and infrastructure represent a blatant disregard for human life and constitute a serious violation of international law and international humanitarian law. They are unconscionable. Rockets have once again landed in central Kyiv, Zaporizhia, and other Ukrainian cities. The deliberate targeting of civilians is a war crime. These actions by Russia are a serious escalation and must not go unpunished. There must be no impunity for these crimes. Ireland calls on the Russian Federation to immediately cease hostilities and unconditionally withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine. We call on the Russian Federation to refrain from further threats or the use of force of any kind, including nuclear weapons, against Ukraine or any other member state, which could have serious implications beyond the region. Mr. President, fellow member states, this is not just about Ukraine, this is about the entirety of the UN membership. If we fail to hold Russia accountable, we send a signal to large, powerful countries that they can prey on their neighbours with impunity. Every state relies on the rules-based international order for our prosperity, for our independence, for our sovereignty. Russia has turned its back on this order, and it is incumbent on each and every one of us to defend it. If we do not reject Russia's actions in the clearest terms, in the clearest possible terms, we allow the world to be governed by force and not through dialogue, and that is simply unacceptable. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Mr. President, Italy aligns itself to the statement delivered yesterday by the European Union and wishes to add some remarks in its national capacity. We reject and unequivocally condemn the illegal attempted annexation by Russia of the Ukrainian provinces of Donetsk, Kherson, Lugansk, and Zaporizhia. Such unilateral annexations is void and cannot determine any legal effect whatsoever. Italy deplores in the strongest terms the sham referendum in Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia during its war of aggression against Ukraine. Such actions constitute a flagrant breach of the UN Charter and blatantly violate international law and the principles of the Helsinki Final Act. Mr. President, far from being an exercise of self-determination, the sham referenda took place amidst widespread and systematic abuses of human rights and intimidation. It is crystal clear that they only represent the attempt to unilaterally annex territories of a sovereign state through the use of coercion and military force. Italy does not and will never recognize the illegal attempted annexation, just as it has not recognized the illegal attempted annexation of Crimea, and calls on all states to do the same. We see this not as a discretionary choice for states, but rather as our common duty under international law. Mr. President, Italy strongly condemns the recent brutal and indiscriminate Russian attacks against many cities across Ukraine, deliberately targeting civilians, and calls on Russia to put an end to its military aggression, withdraw from all Ukrainian territories, and genuinely commit to diplomatic dialogue. Italy expresses its strong support for urgent and concrete de-escalation and a peaceful resolution with respect for Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, along the lines of the resolutions OP7. Russia needs to stop immediately this senseless war, which is causing huge human losses and it's having serious economic repercussions around the world and hitting the most vulnerable countries and categories of people. Italy continues to firmly stand on the side of the Ukrainian people and in defense of its independence. sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders. We must all stand together to resist Russia's actions against a sovereign UN member state and uphold the principles of the UN Charter. Therefore, we call on all UN member states to support the draft resolution and vote yes. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Romania aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, and I would like to add a few remarks on my national capacity. This is indeed a somber occasion. The reconvening of the 11th Emergency Special Session of this General Assembly can only mean that we are again confronted with a dire situation. And we are also confronted with a choice between accepting insecurity and lawlessness or fighting with an immovable resolve to protect and uphold the principles we agreed upon for our individual and collective good: equal sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force. The Russian Federation actions are very clear. It directed a brutal, unjustified, and unprovoked illegal military aggression against Ukraine. Russia proceeded to organize so-called illegal referenda in 4 Ukrainian regions under occupation and subsequently attempted to annex them. These actions are mere attempts to justify its illegal military occupation of territories belonging to another sovereign state and represent an irresponsible escalation of the current situation. As in the case of the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol, the actions of the Russian Federation are based on the illegal use of force, and they do represent serious violations of the most important principles and norms of international law enshrined first and foremost in the UN Charter. We also strongly condemn the recent missile attacks against civilian objectives in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, resulting in destruction of civilian infrastructure and loss of innocent civilian lives. In the face of such flagrant violations of international law, our response must be prompt and definitive. We must condemn these actions and make clear that the so-called referenda and the attempted illegal annexation have no validity. What is more, we have a legal obligation not to recognize any alteration of the status of the Ukrainian regions concerned. And let us be clear, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Crimea, and Sevastopol are Ukraine. The text before us is simple and straightforward. It reflects nothing more than the most well-known rules of international law. This resolution defends the UN Charter, and it ultimately attempts to protect each and every one of us present in this hall. Ukraine is a victim of forceful territorial acquisitions, and if this is left unsanctioned, it could become the worst precedent of the beginning of the decay of the international order many generations before us have strived to build in the aftermath of devastating world wars to ensure the lasting reign of peace and prosperity. But the text before us also represents something else, a building block for peace. The text calls on member states and international organizations to support the escalation and the peaceful resolution of this conflict. Peace remains our perpetual goal. And peace can be only achieved by boldly facing the aggressor and taking concrete actions to enforce the principles of international law. Negotiations while looking down the barrel of a gun cannot be called negotiations and cannot produce anything that would have any legal effect attached to it. The Russian Federation must, as a matter of urgency, reverse its illegal actions and unconditionally withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine, understood within its internationally recognized borders. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the opportunity to demand exactly this with the full authority of the most representative UN organ. And I hope the result of the vote today will prove that this opportunity was not wasted. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Romania, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bulgaria.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the European Union. I would like to highlight a few points in my national capacity. Mr. President, for the third time this year, the General Assembly reconvenes in an emergency special session to address yet another escalation of the Russian Federation's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of choice against Ukraine, and because of yet another veto of the Russian Federation that prevented the Security Council from exercising its duties. While we are meeting prompted by the attempted illegal annexation by the Russian Federation of the occupied territories in the Ukrainian Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, on Monday, Russian armed forces struck cities around Ukraine, leaving at least 12 civilians dead and more than 100 injured. Let us be clear, attacks on civilians are prohibited under international humanitarian law and thus constitute war crimes for which perpetrators will be held accountable. Mr. President, colleagues, Bulgaria categorically rejects and condemns in the strongest possible terms the attempt to the illegal annexation by the Russian Federation of the occupied territories in the Ukrainian Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions following the illegal so-called referenda that were neither free nor fair. We will never recognize it, just as we never recognized the illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol in 2014. Bulgaria reiterates its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. The actions of the Russian Federation not only blatantly undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also demonstrate its strive to redraw the post-Cold War boundaries in Europe and to dismantle the existing world order. This war must end now, and the Russian Federation must end it by abiding by its international commitments and by immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The means of war in resolving disputes and tensions and the illegal annexation of a sovereign country's land have no place in the 21st century. Full respect of the UN Charter and international law are the only guarantee for global peace and security and the only universally effective tool that provides justice and accountability. Colleagues, we are having this debate today not because of Ukraine, but because of all of us. Today it is Ukraine. Tomorrow it could be any one of us unless we show a firm and united stance against any violation of the principles of the UN Charter and international law. The draft resolution before us does exactly that. It stands for the Charter and international law. It stands for all of us. Therefore, we ask you to vote in favor of the text before us. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bulgaria, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank you for resuming the 11th emergency special session of this General Assembly. I also underscore my gratitude for the way in which you steered the procedural discussions at the beginning of this 11th emergency special session. Ecuador closely followed, and followed with great concern indeed, the Security Council meeting held on the 30th of September. During this meeting, the Council considered and vetoed the draft resolution which sought to reaffirm and defend the respect for and guarantees of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We are grateful to the Security Council for presenting a special report on that veto in accordance with Resolution 76/262 of the General Assembly. Since its inception as a republic, Ecuador, my country, has rejected and condemned the use of force by one state against another, and has done so in line with the principles of our foreign policy and in honor of our vocation for peace. As such, we don't recognize, nor will we recognize, the acquisition of territory by force. For these reasons, observing the principles enshrined in international law, as well as in the United Nations Charter that enshrines the principle of the territorial integrity of states, Ecuador rejects the referenda held in the territories under foreign military occupation in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. These referenda undermine the sovereignty of Ukraine and lack any legal validity. For this reason, Ecuador also decided to co-sponsor and support the draft resolution contained in A/ES/11/L5, and we invite all delegations to do the same. We add our voice to countries demanding that the Russian Federation revoke its decisions taken on the 21st of February and the 29th of September of this year related to the status of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. We demand that human rights and international law be respected in the occupied territories. Mr. President, my delegation reiterates its appeal to the Russian Federation to withdraw its troops from Ukraine immediately, and we demand that they respect the sovereignty, unity, independence of their people and the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. 7 months have elapsed since the aggression against Ukraine began, and we face the growing threat of this conflict irreversibly affecting humankind. As such, we reiterate our support for the efforts being conducted by the Secretary General, and we also champion and support other initiatives advocating for political dialogue and negotiations. And we hope that these endeavours will provide a diplomatic solution to this crisis. And this is all in accordance with what has been called for by several regional and sub-regional organisations, including the OAS, during the assembly held in Lima last week. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ecuador, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovakia.
Mr. President, Slovakia fully aligns itself with the statement made earlier by the distinguished representative of the European Union and wishes to add some remarks in its national capacity. The Slovak Republic unequivocally condemns the attempted illegal annexation of further territories of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. In fact, it is not the first time that I am taking the floor in this emergency special session like most of my other colleagues. In fact, we were hoping earlier that the calls that we addressed in the General Assembly, especially on the aggressor, on the Russian Federation, would be heard in the interest of the people that are suffering on a daily basis and in the interest of respecting the very basic values and principles of international law and the UN Charter. Yet, it's far from being the case. And the situation, unfortunately, further escalates, including with the illegal annexations and the sham referenda, not to even mention the continued suffering of the Ukrainian people. And it has to stop. That's a call that has to be heard again in this General Assembly hall, and that we address very urgently to the representatives of the Russian Federation. We are outraged that despite calls from the majority of the world states and the international community, the Russian Federation has taken yet another step in stark contradiction to the basic democratic principles and the constitutional order of Ukraine. The Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, besides abusing its veto right in the Security Council, once again flagrantly violated international law, including the UN Charter, in particular the principles of independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-intervention in the internal affairs of states. Slovakia recognizes Ukraine as an independent, sovereign state with unquestionable territorial integrity. All acts associated with the forcible acquisition of Ukrainian territory by the Russian Federation are null, void, and illegitimate. The so-called referenda in the occupied regions took place during an active armed conflict in areas under Russian occupation and cannot by any circumstances be called a true expression of the will of the people. Slovakia will never recognize these territories as anything but a part of Ukraine. We will continue to provide multifaceted support to our neighboring country of Ukraine in its just struggle to preserve its statehood, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders. The pre-orchestrated sham referenda and subsequent attempted illegal annexation of parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporozhye regions, additional to previous attempted illegal annexation of Crimea, represent a deliberate escalation by the Russian Federation, which is part of its ongoing military aggression against Ukraine. We therefore once again reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to cease its military activities in Ukraine and immediately and unconditionally withdraw all its troops, military equipment, and occupation administration structures from Ukrainian territory. It was clearly already expressed before that it is Russian Federation that started the war, and it is only the Russian Federation that can end it, and it should be done immediately and without any delay. All those who participated in the preparation and implementation of the attempted illegal annexation of further parts of Ukrainian territory to the Russian Federation must be held accountable for their actions. This includes all crimes committed and now being documented in Ukraine. The accountability context remains a key component of our attention and deserves further attention from the international community and from the United Nations. I would also like to seize this opportunity to condemn once again the Russian propaganda and related distortion of facts and promotion of alternative reality, so to say, which the Russian Federation also expressed today. Slovakia totally rejects this approach and finds it highly deplorable. To conclude, Mr. President, I would like to appeal to each and every delegation in this room to vote in favor of the presented draft resolution. As others have already clearly expressed, this time it is attempted illegal annexation of parts of Ukraine by Russia, but next time it might be something similar. It might be annexation of your own territory by any of your neighbors with military prevalence. This is dangerous, unacceptable, and it is in our collective interest to take collective and resolute action. The international community must send a clear signal that such behavior cannot and will not be tolerated. And exactly for this reason, this is not a vote for Ukraine or choosing between Ukraine or Russia. This is a vote between the respect of core principles of international law and the UN Charter, or complete anarchy and arbitrariness, between the power of law and the power of force. I think we should all be clear what we want to vote for and on which side we want to be in this important issue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovakia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, we are here today to once again address the situation in Ukraine. 7 months have now passed since the UN General Assembly Emergency Special Session was first called on this matter in March. Since then, the international community has condemned the Russian Federation's armed invasion against Ukraine and urged the peaceful resolution of conflict. Unfortunately, Russia has not answered the repeated calls of the international community. The unprovoked aggression has tragically continued, killing thousands and displacing millions of Ukrainians. We were especially shocked by the recent Russian missile attacks targeting cities and innocent civilians across Ukraine. Russia even announced the annexation of parts of Ukraine territory while combat is still underway in those regions. Most members of this august body have repeatedly referred, almost mantra-like, to the importance of national sovereignty and territorial integrity as a basic principle of international relations. Today, the Republic of Korea joins many others in unequivocally reiterating its support for the sovereignty, political independence, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. My government does not recognize the so-called referenda held under military coercion in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and cannot accept Russia's attempt to divide Ukrainian territory. The Republic of Korea, through its own painful experiences, can testify that any attempt to divide a nation in any form or method is merely the beginning of lasting, very serious troubles rather than a solution. We should also recall the regrettable part of our history when the League of Nations, the UN's predecessor, started to collapse in the 1930s when expansionist military powers invaded neighboring countries. All of us are well aware of the ensuing horrors. All of us here today owe it to ourselves to prove in the eyes of the future generations that the United Nations can fulfill its mandate now. Mr. President, the core values of the United Nations are at stake today. As the Secretary General made clear in his statement, any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and the principles of international law. Russia's illegal actions will not be accepted nor tolerated by the international community. In this regard, my delegation notes with deep interest that the DPRK is the only country so far to issue a statement endorsing the so-called referenda and supporting the Russian annexation. Beforehand, only 2 countries, including the DPRK, recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. Mr. President, this is why the President of the Republic of Korea emphasized in this chamber last month that member states altogether have to overcome threats to freedom and peace through international cooperation, solidarity, and a fearless commitment to universal norms consolidated within the UN system. As we seek ways to further contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security, the Republic of Korea has joined the co-sponsorship of this important resolution. We also provided and pledged $100 million worth of assistance to Ukraine, which includes the provision of medical items as well as flexible funding in response to the UN-led appeal. We will continue to support ongoing efforts by the Secretary General and regional and international organizations. Lastly, Mr. President, my delegation is deeply concerned about Russia's recent escalatory nuclear rhetoric against non-nuclear state, which squarely contradicts the joint leaders' statement by the P5 in January of this year. We call on Russia to assume their due and special responsibilities as a nuclear weapon state and a permanent member of the Security Council by translating its crucial commitment in the statement into actions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Mr. President, colleagues, Australia is proud to stand alongside Ukraine and many, many other member states here today. Member states determined to uphold the UN Charter. Member states determined to condemn Russia's sham referenda in the occupied regions of Ukraine. Member states determined to condemn Russia's illegal attempted annexation of Ukrainian territory. We remain committed to the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognised borders. Mr. President, let's be absolutely clear. Russia's sham referenda in the occupied areas of Ukraine have no legal effects. Let me repeat that. Russia's sham referenda in the occupied areas of Ukraine have no legal effect. Russia's attempted annexation is illegal. It's a dangerous escalation. And we urge all member states to support the resolution before us. Doing so will demonstrate our unreserved commitment to upholding international law, including our obligations under the UN Charter. Mr. President, we all seek a peaceful and prosperous world where sovereignty and territorial integrity are respected. We must show all those contemplating acts of aggression that the international community stands together in firm defence of these principles. Mr. President, Australia will continue to stand with the brave people of Ukraine. Australia responded swiftly to President Putin's attempted illegal annexation of the Ukrainian regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, with additional targeted financial sanctions and travel bans on 28 Russian-appointed separatists, ministers and senior officials. Australia has also filed an intervention in the International Court of Justice case brought by Ukraine against Russia, supporting Ukraine's claims that Russia has violated the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Mr. President, colleagues, These actions underscore Australia's support for Ukraine and the resolution before us today, and reinforce Australia's strong objection to the actions of President Putin and those carrying out his orders. Mr. President, Australia continues to call on Russia to comply with its obligations under international law, including the UN Charter, and immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine. Mr. President, we call for peace, a peace that is not just the absence of war, but that enables the people of Ukraine to live according to their own rules, according to their own sovereignty, and to have their own freedom. Australia pays tribute to the remarkable resilience and the remarkable courage shown by the Ukrainian people. Colleagues, now is the time for the international community to show courage and conviction in support of Ukraine. Now is the time to act together. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Mr. President, Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, and this is an article which governs the peaceful coexistence of states, and it states that all states must involve the use of force or threat of use of force against the sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence of states. It also states that we must resolve disputes via peaceful means and discharge in good faith commitments entered into. As such, the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of each and every one of the member states of the United Nations, including Ukraine, must be respected and protected. Chile is a faithful upholder of the United Nations Charter and international law. We reiterate our commitment to the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. As such, we believe that the referenda held in the regions and cities of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia lack all legal validity. Moreover, we reaffirm the need for Russia to withdraw its troops to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. This also includes Crimea. The international community cannot remain indifferent to this attempted illegal annexation of Ukrainian regions. Nothing justifies violating the principles and provisions of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. Chile supports the statement made by the Secretary General on Thursday, the 29th of September. In that statement, he stated that the United Nations Charter is clear. Any acquisition of territory in one state by another state which is the result of force or the threat of force is a violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter and of international law. We underscore the work on the ground and efforts being undertaken by many stakeholders in order to guarantee peace and security to all peoples. Moreover, we underscore the diplomatic steps taken by countries such as Turkey, the Ukraine Crisis Coordinator, and we also point to the work being undertaken by residential coordinators in order to achieve a peaceful solution through dialogue between parties to the conflict. Mr. President, the government of Chile expresses once more its absolute condemnation and rejection in the strongest possible terms of the war crimes perpetrated in Ukrainian territory controlled by Russian forces. These acts have been brought to light by the Commission of Inquiry in Ukraine. International peace and security is being undermined by this war, and this war has meant that we've moved backwards hundreds of years because we're hearing irresponsible threats regarding the use of nuclear weapons. It is in light of all of the above, Mr. President, that my country has decided to co-sponsor the draft resolution presented before this Assembly. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam's consistent position related to the basic conduct of international relations has been time and again reiterated. We have always believed in the utmost importance of ensuring full respect for the fundamental principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Such principles include sovereign equality among states, peaceful settlement of disputes, non-interference in matters within the domestic jurisdiction of states, and refrainment from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state. But the most sacrosanct and supreme among them all is respect for national sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states. All nations must fully abide by their obligations and commitment under treaties that they are parties to, including the recognition of independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states in their internationally recognized borders. That must be the principle that all states have to fully uphold in their international relations. That is the prerequisite for international peace and security. Mr. President, such earnest belief in these fundamental principles stem dearly from Vietnam's own history. Having suffered from decades of wars to defend and reunify our nation, Vietnam understands firsthand the value of peace and cooperation. Regrettably, since the foundation of the United Nations, we have over and over again had to bear witness to wrongful courses of action that have wrought havoc for many nations and people. In the face of such challenges, throughout the decades, the Vietnamese people have strived for the righteous struggle shared by all progressive peoples, especially in our common advocate for the promotion of friendly relations among states and against the threat or use of force in violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. It is therefore with a heavy heart that we have been closely following the situation relating to Ukraine. We are particularly gravely concerned over recent development, which may lead to further escalation and suffering, and heighten the risk of miscalculation and confrontation beyond anyone's imaginations. With grave impact for international peace, security, stability, development, and cooperation. The longer this continues, the farther we are from an acceptable settlement of disputes among parties concerned. Furthermore, this is happening even when the multidimensional consequences for our peoples have now been felt deeply across regions, with the burning issues that we all heard from leaders at the high-level general debate just a few days ago. Vietnam once more reiterates our consistent call for the exercise of utmost restraint, immediate cessation of hostilities, as well as avoiding actions that may further escalate the situation. We also call for an early resumption of dialogue and negotiations with a view to achieving a comprehensive solution acceptable to all, taking into account the legitimate interests and concerns of all parties in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. It is also important to ensure safety and security for the people and critical civilian infrastructure, including nuclear facilities. The international community must join hands to create an environment conducive to such ends. that depends on refraining from actions that may drive the parties further apart and further delay the prospect of settlement. It is important to bear in mind that what is at stake is the interest of peace, stability, and development of all states concerned, not only Europe, but also the world as a whole. But first and foremost, the concerns and daily lives of each and every people who are suffering on the ground now. We therefore call on international partners to provide further efforts for humanitarian assistance for those in need. We commend the operations by various UN agencies and other regional and international agencies in this regard. At the same time, it is important to continue efforts aimed at de-escalation and mediation among parties concerned through all possible channels. We welcome efforts by the Secretary General and other relevant partners for their tireless endeavors in helping bring all parties together. Vietnam stands ready to constructively contribute to these diplomatic efforts and to the reconstruction and restoration in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Colombia rejects the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any country because such an act constitutes a direct violation of the purposes and fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter and of international law. We recall the provisions of Resolution 2625 of the General Assembly adopted in 1970. According to this resolution, no territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal. Precisely for this reason, we will vote in favor of the resolution in defense of these principles, duties, and principles contained in the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, Colombia reiterates its rejection of war and of violence under any circumstance. Moreover, my country, in line with its policy of total peace, urges parties to the conflict to seek a negotiated and peaceful solution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Czechia.
Mr. President, Czechia fully aligns itself with the EU statement, and I would like to add the following in my national capacity. Despite numerous calls by the international community to immediately stop its military aggression against Ukraine, the Russian Federation has decided to further escalate its aggressive war by supporting the illegal so-called referenda, by mobilization of its citizens, and by repeated threats to use nuclear weapons. Bearing witness to that are the ongoing cowardly missile attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in many Ukrainian cities and in the very center of Kiev. Putin's regime once again flagrantly violates the basic principles of the UN Charter and international law, and threatens security of Europe as well as the very nature of the current global order. Changing the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine by force constitutes a clear and serious breach of the UN Charter. This step has absolutely no validity under international law. Many world leaders had warned about the predicted outcome of the illegal sham referenda even before their falsified results were announced. We urge all UN member states to reject this illegal annexation by voting yes for the present draft resolution. Russian illegal actions already show their damaging global impact. As they multiply, every member of the international community is now threatened by such unscrupulous conduct. Mr. President, we have not recognized the illegal annexation of Crimea, and we will never recognize the illegal annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson oblasts of Ukraine. We will never recognize any decision taken by Russia following the attempted illegal annexation, including the simplified procedure to obtain Russian citizenship and Russian passports. Czechia reiterates its full support for sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and territorial waters. Organizing fake voting amidst the war is yet another proof that Ukrainian citizens are facing widespread and systematic human rights abuses and intimidation by Russia and its illegally appointed authorities in the temporarily occupied territories. The manipulated public vote presents no expression of the real free will of the local Ukrainian citizens, who are exposed to inhuman conditions, brutal torture, and mass killings. All perpetrators of the most serious crimes under international law must be held accountable, same as those involved in organizing such sham voting. Czechia supports the creation of special international tribunal to bring to justice the official representatives of the Russian Federation responsible for the crime of aggression against the neighboring state as they seek to destroy its free existence. Once again, we strongly urge the Russian Federation to stop this war and immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its troops from the territory of Ukraine. Russian actions gravely damage the global economy and food security of many countries gathered here today. Furthermore, it seriously threatens the rules-based international order and harms all UN member states. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Czechia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, today the situation of the Ukraine is now focusing the attention of the international community. The self-determination is the legal right of the people to decide their own destiny and international relation. Also, the self-determination is legitimate right to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status without interference from others as a basic principle stipulated in UN Charter and the other international law. The residents in People's Republic of Donetsk, People's Republic of Lugansk, and the regions of the Kherson and Zaporozhye have the due right to freely determine and choose their sovereignty and international political status at their own discretion. The people in those regions have exercised their due right through referenda, the hold from 23 to 27 September 2022. We recognize that the referenda were conducted in accordance with the UN Charter and international law, which stipulate principles of the equal rights and self-determination of people. Therefore, we respect the will of the people in People's Republic of the Donetsk, People's Republic of the Lugansk, and the regions of the Kherson and Zaporozhye, who aspire to integration into the Russian Federation and support the position of the government of the Russian Federation of the making of said regions component of the Russian Federation. We strongly insist that principle of self-determination enshrined in UN Charter international law must not be applied in selective and partial manner. Mr. President, we clearly remember that sovereignty and territorial integrity of the former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya were violated brutally by United States and Western countries under the pretext of international peace and security. But unlawful and illegal acts of the Western countries have never been called into question in UN Security Council. It is absurd for Western countries that they have devastated sovereign states in the past are talking about respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Ukraine, of the referenda holding People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk, and regions of the Kherson and Zaporozhye. Even today, United States interfere in internal affairs of sovereign states and infringe upon their legal rights by abusing UN Security Council in order to maintain hegemonic unipolar world. This is the same old trick of the United States, and the world is witnessing a lot of the similar illegal acts, not only in 20th century, but also 21st century. High-handedness and arbitrary practice and the partial and double standard acts can never be tolerated in any case. In conclusion, we strongly believe that the result of the referenda took place in People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk and the regions of the Kherson and Zaporozhye must be respected in accordance with the basic principle of self-determination and non-interference in internal affairs of others. Also, the position of any sovereign state must be respected on this floor. But one previous speaker just before mentioned the position of the DPRK. His remark is mostly politically motivated remark. Of course, I can fully understand that he can say that because his country is not a sovereign state. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova.
Mr. President, at the outset, my delegation welcomes the resumption of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly to consider the critical issue of so-called referendums held illegally by the Russian Federation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, in the regions of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. While the Republic of Moldova aligns itself with the EU statement, I would like to add the following remarks in our national capacity. Distinguished delegates, for more than 8 months now, our neighboring country, Ukraine, is defending its territory from the Russian Federation unprovoked war of aggression, which has triggered the largest humanitarian and refugee crisis in Europe since the end of the Second World War, prompted global food shortages, economic downturn, and deepened the European energy crisis. The reports of massive human rights violation and disrespect for international humanitarian as well as international law are stated. We have all been appalled by the massive Russian missile attacks conducted recently against Ukrainian cities, especially civilian and critical infrastructure. These attacks are causing human losses and suffering and significant destruction. According to the verified airspace monitoring data, 3 of cruise missiles launched from the Russian military ships located in the Black Sea or on targets in Ukraine have crossed Moldovan airspace. The Republic of Moldova firmly condemns the violation of its sovereign airspace. This incident created serious risks to the security of the Republic of Moldova. Any escalation is also increasing the security risks for the entire region and to the Republic of Moldova as an immediate neighbor of Ukraine. Now, these risks include not only those posed by the use of conventional arms, but also of nuclear ones. We express deep and great concern about the military activities in and around Ukraine's nuclear sites and the dangerous rhetoric about the possible use of nuclear weapons. All these worrying developments pose a major threat not only for the region, but also for the entire world. In this sense, we cannot emphasize enough the importance of stopping the shelling in and around those sites with a view to avoiding catastrophic consequences. The Republic of Moldova strongly condemns the so-called referendums illegally organized by the Russian Federation in the territory-occupied Ukrainian regions of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Conducting these pseudo-referendums during the ongoing war and using them as a pretext to annex a part of Ukrainian sovereign territory occupied by force is a severe infringement of the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity and other fundamentals of the international law. The Republic of Moldova does not and will not recognize the results of these illegal actions and reiterates its steadfast support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. In the light of the above, my delegation co-authored and will vote in favor of a resolution entitled Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, Defending the Principles of the United Nations Charter. The Republic of Moldova calls once again the Russian Federation to stop its aggression and immediately withdraw its military forces from the sovereign Ukrainian territory. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Federal States of Micronesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I shall be very brief. The brevity of my statement does not in any way diminish the grave concern of my delegation on recent developments in Ukraine and of the importance we attach to the issue before this Assembly. Micronesia aligns its statement with a statement delivered earlier by the permanent representative of Fiji on behalf of the Pacific Island Forum. My delegation appreciates the timely resumption of the emergency special session, as we are deeply troubled by the events of recent days. We do not recognize the so-called referenda held in the 4 occupied regions and rejects any attempt by the Russian Federation to incorporate Ukrainian territory. The annexation of Ukrainian territory by the Russian Federation is yet again another violation of the principles of our United Nations Charter and international law. Micronesia fully supports the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and calls the immediate withdrawal of all Russian forces from said territory. Finally, Micronesia has co-sponsored the resolution and will vote yes. We encourage all members of this Assembly to uphold the UN Charter and vote in favor of the resolution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Federal States of Micronesia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Croatia aligns itself with the EU statement. I would like to add some remarks in my national capacity. In just a couple of months, Russian aggression on Ukraine has moved a long way, from a so-called special military operation to a brink of a nuclear Armageddon. Tens of thousands have died so far, hundreds of thousands or even millions may in future. Have we done enough to stop it? The crimes committed are piling up. It started with a crime of aggression and continued with war crimes and crimes against humanity. We are meeting today because of yet another most recent crime, illegal annexation of the temporarily occupied territories in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, the aggression on Ukraine clearly demonstrates the weakness of our institutional capacity to protect countries as well as populations from occupation and atrocity crimes, especially when the aggressor is one of the permanent members of the Security Council. It is obvious that we need to improve the UN's prevention and protection capacity, but that does not relieve us of the responsibility to do as much as we can within the existing institutional framework. When the Security Council was blocked because of the veto power before, we have taken a joint action through the GA, overwhelmingly condemning the crime of aggression, warning that there would be accountability for the crimes committed, and isolating the perpetrator. Now we should do the same and show resolve and provide decisive response to this attempt of annexation, which is null and void and cannot produce any legal effects under international law. We must reject and condemn it in the strongest and clearest terms. By doing that, we are not only protecting Ukraine, but also our own sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the UN Charter, the rule-based international order, and the future of our children. The resolution before us, unfortunately, is not legally binding, but its strength comes from the widespread condemnation of this illegal annexation as yet another violation of international law by the Russian Federation. However, the International Court of Justice did issue a legally binding order requesting the Russian Federation to immediately stop its military operation in Ukraine. Blatantly ignoring it, the Russian Federation continued with its aggression, and now, when the situation in the battlefield is changing in Ukraine's favor, it is escalating the conflict through partial mobilization, illegal annexation, and targeting of the crucial civilian infrastructure as well as civilians themselves. What kind of greed for imperial power and land grab is inciting the leadership of the largest country in the world to annex territory of its brotherly neighbors and sacrifice tens of thousands of lives of Ukrainians, as well as of its own citizens, for this sickening plan? To expose to food insecurity, energy shortages, setback in development, and the danger of possible nuclear Armageddon the whole world. It is a sort of greed that can swallow our whole planet if we let it happen. We must stand together and protect Ukraine, the Charter of the UN, and our own future. We, the peoples, are watching us today as well as our vote. Let us not disappoint them. A yes vote for this resolution is a vote for the just peace in Ukraine, as well as the re-establishment of the rule of law in international relations. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Croatia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Hungary.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, Hungary aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states, and I wish to make the following remarks in our national capacity. Hungary reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty within its internationally recognized borders. With regard to the so-called referenda held in the occupied territories of Ukraine, we firmly reject and unequivocally condemn the illegal annexation by Russia of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. The referenda are not only blatantly violating the fundamental rights of Ukraine to sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, but also several of the core principles as enshrined in the UN Charter and international law. We will never recognize the illegal referenda, neither the illegal annexation. Furthermore, we reaffirm that Ukraine is exercising its legitimate right to defend itself against the Russian aggression, to regain full control of its territory, and has the right to liberate occupied territories within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, the UN Charter is not optional. Every member state represented in this chamber have to abide by the rules that were set out to protect the international order. If one member state decides to disregard the rules, there will undoubtedly be others who will not feel obliged to respect these rules. Today, it is the sovereignty of Ukraine. Tomorrow, it might be another state, another principle disregarded, another fundamental right violated. We need to be clear that the action of the Russian Federation is a violation of rights today, and if we fail to step up against it, it could be improperly misconstrued as a precedent in the future. Therefore, our common determination to protect the rules-based international order and international law shall be strong and united. Mr. President, we must also stress that any use or any threat of use of weapons of mass destruction is contrary to the provisions of international law, including the UN Charter or the commitments parties made inter alia in the Budapest Memorandum or the NPT review conferences. Let me be clear. Hungary condemns any threat of a nuclear war. A nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must never be fought. Mr. President, sadly, after more than half a year in this conflict, we are witnessing worrying trends and still do not see any signs of the cessation of the hostilities. It is our view that the conflict is on an alarmingly wrong trajectory that foreseeably only leads to a further spiral of escalation. We see around the globe that after barely recovering from the worst pandemic in more than a century, as a result of the war in Ukraine, too many member states find themselves to be in a particularly vulnerable situation, faced with unprecedented interlocking crises. Energy, food, water crisis, and the adverse effects of climate change, exacerbated by a cost of living crisis, pile on the hardship of people around the world, putting the resilience of member states to a test. As a result, uncertainty and political upheaval is growing across the world, with potentially far-reaching ramifications to international peace and security, putting the hard-won gains in sustainable development into jeopardy. From the perspective of Hungary, the war is on our neighboring country. It constitutes a great risk, security risk, with a multidimensional effect on our society. The ensuing rise in the cost of food, energy, and fuel poses a real challenge to us. Furthermore, as winter approaches, we also expect the humanitarian needs stemming from the war only to grow. On a wider horizon, the energy supply routes are being disrupted regionally. As a result, our continent is facing its most severe energy crisis, which also threatens the European economy falling into recession. Faced with these challenges, what we need today, probably more than ever, is dialogue and diplomacy. Therefore, in conclusion, Mr. President, let me reiterate Hungary's urgent call for peace. We have to use whatever tool available for facilitating peace. We have to help this conflict to come to an end as soon as possible. We cannot allow this aggression to threaten all what the international community has achieved under the umbrella of international law in the past 77 years since the adoption of the UN Charter. We need to restore peace, set firmly upon the edifice of the rules-based international order. For all the above reasons, Hungary will vote in favor of the resolution and encourage the others to do the same. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Hungary, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Mr. President, Spain fully aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union in supporting the resolution entitled Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, defending the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Spain wishes to reiterate in the most categorical terms its condemnation of the sham referenda held in parts of Ukrainian territory temporarily under Russian military control. We also condemn in the strongest possible terms measures taken by the Russian authorities attempting to proceed to the illegal annexation of these territories to the Russian Federation. With these measures, once again, Russia has demonstrated its lack of respect for the principles, values and norms enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Russia persists in its sustained and flagrant violations of international law and of its most basic principles. In particular, we refer here to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. These are violations which last March this General Assembly unreservedly condemned. The Secretary-General of the United Nations once again did so on the 29th of September. We will never recognize these attempts at illegal annexation by Russia. Spain reiterates its support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and we demand the immediate, complete and unconditional withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. Meanwhile, as we already did in March, we appeal for an immediate ceasefire, and we support the efforts of the Secretary-General, Guterres, and of member states working to de-escalate the war and to seek a peaceful solution. This solution can only come from respect for international law. This assembly is meeting once again following the veto of the Russian Federation, a veto which paralyzes the Security Council. At the same time, they're threatening to use nuclear weapons. This is unacceptable and a violation of the UN Charter. Russia's actions undermine the very foundations of the international security architecture and directly threaten global peace and stability. The international community cannot afford to set a precedent which would undoubtedly have catastrophic future consequences. In light of all of the above, we ask the international community to strongly and unequivocally condemn Russian acts. It must do this by co-sponsoring and supporting this resolution on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It is precisely at these headquarters where we must reaffirm the norms and principles of the United Nations Charter. Many thanks, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Spain, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Mr. President, my delegation fully subscribes to the statement of the European Union and wishes to make some additional remarks. Cyprus condemns the illegal and illegitimate holding of the so-called referenda in the occupied regions of Ukraine, as well as their subsequent attempted annexation by the Russian Federation. International law is clear. First, the prohibition of the use of force is one of the foundations of the UN Charter. Boundaries cannot be altered by the use of force. Second, an occupying power cannot gain sovereignty over the territory it unlawfully occupies through an attempt of unilateral secession or otherwise. Third, a referendum cannot take place unilaterally without the consent of the government of the territorial state. The occupying power must respect its obligations under international humanitarian law, including the Hague Regulations of 1907 and Geneva Conventions. Fourth, in no circumstances can these so-called referenda be considered as an exercise of right of self-determination through remedial secession. Cyprus is strongly opposed to any modification of the fundamental principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, which is essential for the stability of states and for the international relations between them. Furthermore, we reiterate that states have a legal duty to withhold recognition of acts in violation of norms of international law of peremptory character, such as the creation of an illegal territorial situation by use of force. International law must remain the compass by which states are guided, and it must be applied consistently and globally. Cyprus, as a country that remains divided for almost 50 years as a consequence of the crime of aggression, and as a country who is fully committed to promoting the respect for international law, adds its voice to the international law in defense of the United Nations Charter and the rule of law. Multilateralism and no recourse to unilateral action must guide the conduct of states with a view to the maintenance of international peace and security. We remain deeply concerned about the effectiveness of our system of collective security and disappointed for the fact that the UN Security Council has failed to do everything in its power to prevent and end the war in Ukraine. We fully believe that there is only one way out: diplomacy, not war. Cyprus will vote in favor of the draft resolution under discussion entitled Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, defending the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and also encourages all member states to also support it. In closing, I wish to reiterate that my country remains fully committed to the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cyprus, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, as we have stated in various multilateral fora with regards to the war in Ukraine, the Argentine Republic reiterates, as it did in relation with Crimea, that it will only be through stringent adherence to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, through respect for international law, and through respect for the sovereignty of states and their territorial integrity, that we will be able to reach just and lasting solutions for all political and social stakeholders. Argentina has maintained a consistent position against the acquisition of territories by force and in defense of the principle of territorial integrity. Consequently, the Argentine Republic condemns the aggression against Ukraine and reiterates to the Russian Federation that it must immediately cease its illegitimate use of force and its military operations on Ukrainian territory. Against this backdrop, we do not consider legal the referenda held in the occupied territories in Ukraine from the 23rd to the 27th of September. Mr. President, Any attempt to dismember in whole or in part the national unity and territorial integrity of a state or country or its political independence by force is inconsistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. These referenda constitute an attempt to impair the territorial integrity of Ukraine because they have not been agreed to by the government of that country. As such, from a perspective of international law, the aforementioned referenda are null and void. They have no legal value and do not alter the status of those territories. For the reasons outlined above, we will support the draft resolution which rejects the attempted annexation by Russia of Ukrainian territories, and we will vote in favor of it. Mr. President, we renew the appeal to the Secretary-General and to all existing multilateral fora to cooperate urgently to de-escalate this conflict and to ensure a return to the negotiating table to reach a solution through political dialogue and through any and all peaceful means which might serve to curb the violence. The recent pandemic, climate change, increasingly fragile living conditions in entire regions, displacements of millions of people have demonstrated to us, alongside other global challenges, that these are not the agenda of the future, but rather urgent problems that the international community must confront without delay. Time is running out, and we cannot allow ourselves to continue simply talking about war. We have behind us a tragic past whose consequences we know all too well, and we committed in 1945 to leave that past behind us. Many thanks indeed.
I thank the distinguished representative of Argentina, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for reconvening this emergency special session, and thank you for your leadership in these challenging and sober times. Portugal aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, and I would like to add a few additional remarks in our national capacity. Portugal firmly condemns the so-called referenda organized by the Russian Federation and its subsequent annexation of the Ukrainian territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which constitutes a clear violation of international law and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Portugal considers this referenda and annexation illegal, null, and void, and does not recognize any of its political or legal effects. We reaffirm our support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine within its international recognized borders, and for Ukraine's right to self-defense in the face of ongoing foreign aggression. Mr. President, one cannot claim to be defending the interests of populations by bringing further death and destruction to their doorstep. No security concern could ever be a legitimate reason to invade a neighboring country that posed no threat to the Russian Federation. We cannot be indifferent against these annexations. We cannot turn a blind eye to a decision that compromises the stability of an international order built collectively over 77 years. An international order based on the principles of the rule of law, equal sovereignty, peace and defense of human rights. These are principles that we cannot compromise. We cannot stand still and silence on the ongoing rhetoric on the possible use of nuclear weapons. This is totally unacceptable. We cannot be silent when we witness the shocking and indiscriminate shelling of civilian targets across Ukraine's cities, scaling up the violence and the unbearable death toll of this war. The authors of these and other attacks should be held accountable under international law. We cannot be silent when we see the spillover effects from the war in Ukraine jeopardize millions of people's food and energy security. We fully support the efforts coordinated by the UN to address the global impact of the conflict and we call for the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We commend the Secretary General courageous leadership in this regard and this vision for a much-needed new agenda for peace. Mr. President, the Russian Federation must stop this war and withdraw from Ukraine. And we must continue to address the situation collectively to preserve a rules-based international order, to stand for the rule of law, to abide by the principles of peace and security that are the foundation of this organization, and to uphold the UN Charter. This is why we co-sponsored and we will vote in favor of the resolution before us, and we strongly encourage others to do the same. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Portugal, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, Greece allies with the statement delivered by the European Union and would like to add the following in our national capacity. Today's debate concerns each and every member state. It is about upholding the Charter of the United Nations and the core principles of our organization. It is about respecting the most basic principles of international law. Greece reiterates what has been said in this chamber. The UN Charter is clear. Article 2, paragraph 4 of the UN Charter stipulates all members shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. This is the guiding principle underpinning the UN Charter, and all states should abide to it. Respect of the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of all countries form the cornerstone of international law and the main pillar of the Greek foreign policy. This is not merely our unwavering principled position. This is the foundation of international order. Revisionism is the main threat to world peace, no matter where it comes from. Violations of international law, no matter whom they target, are a threat to us all. Any unprovoked aggression, any decision, any threat that targets the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a member state cannot and should not be tolerated and has no place in the 21st century. We can make no exceptions, and we must maintain a consistent stance across the board. We will not allow a dangerous precedent which would give the green light for similar attacks and violations of international law globally and against other respective members of the international community. Any act that is undermining the rules-based international order and violating the fundamental rights of Ukraine to independence and sovereignty cannot be recognized. If we do not condemn the actions of the Russian Federation in Ukraine today, then we open the way for similar attacks on any and all of our countries tomorrow. Now it is the time to show solidarity and a strong commitment to peace and stability. Our message should be clear and strong, upholding the fundamental principles of our Charter and international law. We categorically condemn the illegal annexation of Ukraine's regions Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which constitutes a flagrant violation of international law. It is null and void and cannot produce any legal effect whatsoever. Greece will spare no efforts for the protection of the Greek community in Ukraine, especially in the east, and all the civilians that are subjected to immense unnecessary suffering. Greece will spare no efforts for justice to be done. We mobilize with our partners to combat impunity for war crimes and crimes against humanity, including gender-based violence. We will spare no efforts towards peace and upholding the principles of our Charter. Today, we vote in favor. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Greece, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liberia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, as the United Nations, we continue to witness inexcusable acts of violence and forceful annexation of regions within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Donetsk. This is one of the unprecedented moments in international history and one that leaves an indelible stain on our great charter. Once again, there is a territorial integrity issue. Russia's sham referenda and forceful annexation of the aforementioned 4 Ukrainian territories is in flagrant violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, the United Nations Charter and international law, as well as global peace and stability. Article 2 of the UN Charter states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purpose of the United Nations. This article prohibits the threat of use of force by UN member states and calls on all members to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of other states. Liberia condemns the violence, threats of violence, and other acts of intimidation increasingly taking place in Ukraine by Russia, and joins other member states in calling for an end to the chaos and tumult that has been incited in favor of calm and peaceful actions. My delegation wishes to emphasize our position that Ukraine deserves our support in all its efforts to maintain its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. My country furthermore calls upon member states to make all efforts to prevail upon the invading nation, Russia, to cease all the hostilities and the consequent humanitarian disaster and untold suffering of women and children and other vulnerable people of Ukraine. It is imperative, Mr. President, that we act within the framework of the United Nations Charter at all times to promote peaceful coexistence globally. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liberia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Belgium fully aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. I would like to stress, in my national capacity, the following points. These are crucial for the smooth running of international rules-based order, which we all so sorely want. I am speaking to you as a representative, as a country that understands the value of multilateralism, a country which, through its history, is aware of the shared heritage between all members as represented by the UN Charter. do we really need to recall, given the current escalation that of the serious current crisis, that it has one sole unique cause, the fact that a state chose to invade a sovereign neighbouring state in order to try to illegally annex it and forcefully annex a part of the territory of that state. The consequences of this illegal violent action, unfortunately, are being experienced by all members of this organisation. The impact is seriously undermining the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and is exacerbating food insecurity and global energy supplies. The violation of the UN Charter was noted and condemned by this Assembly in March. All violations of the UN Charter must receive a response. Furthermore, not respecting the Charter and international law which regulates interstate relations, human rights violations increase in number. On Monday, towns and densely populated areas where civilians were living were bombed indiscriminately. The protection of civilians, that's just mere words for the aggressor. But what's at stake today is the respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine, a sovereign state. Belgium will not recognise the attempt to annex land conquered by war. Belgium will not recognise these referenda that respect no rules. These annexations are, as stated by the Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, they are illegal. The draft resolution before us today was drafted in an inclusive, transparent manner, linking into the UN Charter. Many countries, be they big or small, from varying geographical areas and with different backgrounds, contributed to it. Belgium fully supports this draft resolution and urges other member states to do the same. Belgium thus joins with those many states that are calling for an immediate, comprehensive, unconditional withdrawal of all military forces of the Russian Federation from Ukrainian territory and calls for the return to its internationally recognized border, as this Assembly has already done. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Mr. President, emergency special session is convened yet again on the situation that is deteriorating. Japan condemns, in the strongest possible terms, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including Russia's recent missile attacks against cities across Ukraine, leading to the death of innocent civilians, and its continued infringement upon Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Russia's attempted illegal annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions into the territory of the Russian Federation by force clearly breaches the United Nations Charter and international law. Japan firmly believes that the General Assembly shall not accept such outrageous actions by Russia. Those actions by Russia have no validity and cannot form the basis for any alteration of the status of these regions of Ukraine. This was clearly stated by Secretary General Guterres as well. Those unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force shall shake the very foundation of the international order and must not occur at any corner of the globe. The Security Council has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, but it failed to act because of the veto cast by Russia, which Japan categorically deplores. In this time of trial, Japan is determined to defend the Charter and multilateralism. Mr. President, my dear colleagues in this General Assembly Hall, the vote on this resolution is not about choosing sides, but rather reflects our collective commitment to upholding the rule of law. Japan trusts the member states to join us in defending the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, Georgia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, and let me add a few remarks in my national capacity. For more than 7 months now, we continue to witness devastating consequences of Russia's full-scale military aggression against Ukraine. Number of civilian casualties in Ukraine and other gross violations of human rights and international humanitarian law has been mounting. We are gravely concerned by the recent deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure in the number of Ukrainian cities. The Russian Federation has continued to disregard the calls of the resolutions adopted in this very hall this year. Georgia condemns Russia's attempted illegal annexation of the Ukrainian regions following the sham referenda and reiterates its unwavering support to the Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders extending to its territorial waters. Excellencies, as a permanent representative of the country that has been occupied by Russia in 2008, let me be absolutely clear. The time matters, words matter, and the action we will take today matters. It matters for the future of the succeeding generations, for the United Nations' future and its ability to tackle and solve the world's most pressing challenges in the months and years to come. It is our collective responsibility to send a clear signal in defense of the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Georgia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan.
Mr. President, the Republic of Azerbaijan and Ukraine support each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity within their internationally recognized borders. This position is grounded in the Charter of the United Nations and international law. Consequently, Azerbaijan does not recognize the result of the referenda held in the territories of Ukraine from 23rd to 27th September 2022, and reiterates its support and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We renew our call for the earliest settlement of the situation exclusively through peaceful diplomatic means. Further, we reiterate that strict compliance with the norms and principles of international law concerning interstate relations and the fulfillment in good faith of the obligations assumed by states under the Charter of the United Nations and international law are of greatest importance for the maintenance of international regional peace, security, and stability. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Aotearoa New Zealand condemns unequivocally Russia's attempts to illegally annex Russia-occupied regions of Ukraine. Russia's sham referenda in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia are illegitimate and have no legal basis for acquisition of Ukraine's territory by Russia. Let us be clear. Russia's attempts to annex these regions are a further act of aggression in clear violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and in flagrant breach of international law. This hall has made clear that annexation by the use of force of the territory of another state or part thereof qualifies as an act of aggression. We, as a General Assembly, as an international community, have an obligation to speak up when there is a violation of international law. We must use our collective voices to condemn any state's flagrant violation of the UN Charter. This is not just our opinion. The facts speak for themselves. The UN Secretary General has been clear. Russia's actions have no basis in any international legal framework and are a clear-cut violation of the UN Charter. Russia must comply with the legally binding orders of the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend its military operations in the territory of Ukraine. We also cannot ignore the real human suffering that extends from this violation of the fundamental purpose and principles of the United Nations. These concepts are not simply theoretical. Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has already caused thousands of deaths, a massive humanitarian crisis, and untold suffering. It must end. We also reiterate the Secretary General's points that the impacts of this war extend well beyond the region, affecting our global economy, especially those of developing countries, and setting back our critical work to deliver life-saving aid in Ukraine and beyond. As we have seen from the start of Russia's invasion, New Zealand continues to call on President Putin to act consistently with international obligations, cease Russia's invasion of Ukraine, withdraw troops, and return to diplomatic negotiations as a pathway to resolution of this conflict. New Zealand continues to stand in support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We call on delegations in the hall to vote in favour of the presented draft resolution. This is a vote not only to support Ukraine, but a vote to support the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, Slovenia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and would like to make the following remarks in our national capacity. Earlier this week, we were again shocked to learn about the missile attacks on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities by the Russian army. We strongly condemn these latest attacks, as well as denounce the Russian Federation's threats to use nuclear weapons. As civilians are often the main victims in armed conflicts, the vast majority of whom are women and children, we once again underline that shelling of residential buildings, as well as other civilian infrastructure, represent most severe violation of international law that cannot remain unpunished. Moreover, we call on the Russian Federation to fully respect international humanitarian law and to allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access and assistance to all persons in need. We call for an immediate, complete and unconditional stop to all fighting. We strongly support all efforts in order to de-escalate the current situation through political dialogue, negotiation and other peaceful means in line with the UN Charter. Mr. President, Slovenia is committed to promotion of culture of peace and dialogue. As a member of the community of small states, we believe in peaceful coexistence of states and cooperation between them. Our future, prosperity and security depends on international cooperation and the respect of the norms set out in the UN Charter and wider international law. The resolution we'll be adopting today is clear. It firmly stands by the goals and principles of the UN Charter, which are being gravely undermined and disregarded as we speak. Mr. President, today's meeting is taking place in response to an attempted illegal annexation of Ukraine's region of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia that are firmly within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. While the principle of self-determination remains the cornerstone of my country's independence, we cannot but echo the Secretary General that a referenda conducted in occupied regions of another country cannot be a genuine expression of a popular will. We therefore firmly reject this attempted illegal annexation. We call on respect of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. Slovenia condemns any unprovoked invasion on any sovereign country under any pretext. Violations of the international legal order that we have all worked so hard to build cannot and must not become the new normal of today's world's affairs. For this reason, Slovenia will be voting in favor of this resolution. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovenia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Thank you, Mr. President. Uruguay has clearly stated in statements made at other meetings of the emergency special session held this year its firm condemnation of the military invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. We've underscored that this is a clear violation of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations that all its members must respect. This position was endorsed a few days ago in the general debate of this Assembly by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uruguay, Ambassador Francisco Gustillo, when he addressed this Assembly. When addressing this Assembly, that minister called upon Russia for a cessation of hostilities and for the withdrawal without delay of troops from Ukrainian territory. Our minister also called upon parties to the conflict to do everything they could to return to the negotiating table in order to resolve their differences peacefully, as stipulated by the United Nations Charter. In the face of new acts conducted by Russian Federation through its use of force to occupy the territories of Ukraine, we state that we do not recognize the annexation by Russia of four Ukrainian territories, following sham referenda convened in the areas of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. These referenda are in clear violation of international law. Uruguay has been very clear regarding its unfettered respect for international law, particularly with the principle of territorial expansion through the use of force, or when it comes to other principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. These principles have been endorsed by the General Assembly, by the Security Council, and by the jurisprudence of the ICJ, and that means that the referenda held on the occupied territories in Ukraine have no legal value. The declared annexation in a context of aggression against another state and in violation of the United Nations Charter and international law means that the votes that took place cannot be considered as a free and genuine expression of popular will. As such, the government of Uruguay reiterates its firm support for the sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And once again, we appeal to the Russian Federation to cease its aggression. It is for these reasons that Uruguay will vote in favor of the draft resolution on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Finally, we reiterate our appeal that through mechanisms for negotiation provided for in the United Nations Charter, with the participation of the Security and the Council and the Secretary General, we find pathways for dialogue which allow us to agree upon steps for the de-escalation of conflict, and we hope that through diplomatic negotiation, parties to the conflict will resolve their differences and put an end to the war. Many thanks.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uruguay, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea.
Mr. President, may I begin by aligning my delegation's remarks with that delivered earlier by my fellow Melanesian and Pacific neighbor, Fiji, as the chair of the Pacific Islands Forum. Today marks the 226th day, or a little over 7 months, since we, the peoples of the United Nations, considered and unanimously supported in this August hall at the 11th Emergency Special Session the resolution A/ES 111/L.1 relating to the Russian Federation's needless aggression against Ukraine, which was roundly condemned and where calls to peacefully end the conflict without preconditions was loud and clear. Papua New Guinea is pleased to have co-sponsored that resolution and also supported the subsequent General Assembly resolution L.2. We continue to stand in solidarity with the people and the government of Ukraine in the face of the unprecedented adversity that continues to be perpetrated by a permanent member of the Security Council, the Russian Federation. It is in this spirit that Papua New Guinea has again given its strong support to the draft resolution before us today, including being a co-sponsor of it. For us, this is the right thing to do. It is unequivocally reminding of us as a small developing country, like many others, of the crucial importance of protecting and defending our sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence as enshrined in the UN Charter and under international law. It is not for external forces to, at their whim, take it away from us. Mr. President, how many more Security Council and General Assembly emergency special sessions must we convene to end the senseless and hostile actions of the aggressor? Actions that not only threatens global peace and security, but also continues to seriously undermine the territorial sovereignty and integrity, as well as prolonging the wanton devastation of the lives and livelihoods of Ukrainians. This cannot and must not be allowed to continue. It is regrettable that despite the emphatic calls by the international community for Russia's siege on Ukraine to cease forthwith, we continue to witness with profound concern the continuing destabilizing and dangerous maneuvers deployed by Russia against Ukraine, including the disastrous global socio-economic impacts this has wrought on all of us. Excellencies and dear colleagues, for my delegation, the Secretary General's expressed views last month on Russia's annexation of the territories of Ukraine is crystal clear and instructive. The so-called referenda under a dubious circumstances in Ukraine territory under Russia's control during an active armed conflict, coupled with the threat or use of force, is highly questionable, to say the least. How many more other parts of Ukraine face the same fate? We strongly condemn the carving up and annexation of the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. My delegation stands together with the Secretary General and other member states who share the same perspective. Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territories is illegal and null and void. For Papua New Guinea, these occupied territories remain a sovereign and integral part of Ukraine. Mr. President, mindful of the harmful and catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, the veiled threats by Russia to use nuclear weapons against those who stand in the way of the aggressor is highly deplorable. It is also irresponsible for a permanent member of a Security Council to threaten international peace and security with such uncalled for action. Not only is the threat or use of force and the use of nuclear weapons a clear violation of the UN Charter and international law, but it is also contrary to the commitments Russia made in the Budapest Memorandum, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conferences, and the statement by the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states in January this year that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Mr. President, let me now turn to the efforts at the procedural level by a certain delegation to have a General Assembly consider a draft resolution before us through a secret ballot. My delegation is of the strong view that an issue of grave importance to the international community regarding global peace and security under the current purview must never be hidden behind the veil of a secret ballot. It is too important for this fundamental issue to be shrouded in secrecy. Why would a member state want to hide behind a secret ballot? What the world, and in particular Ukraine, needs is for us to be accountable and transparent in upholding our UN Charter obligations and responsibilities, including to foster international peace and security. It was pleasing to be part of the overwhelming majority of member states that rallied against the improper use of the secret ballot. Before I conclude, Mr. President, it would be remiss of my delegation not to speak to the 7 members of the Security Council. We applaud those council members that stood up and were counted for peace, stability, and security, as well as for the protection of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine at the Council's meeting on 30th of September this year, which triggered this week's General Assembly emergency special session. We are, however, disappointed that some members of the Council, whom we have entrusted our support in good faith, for them to uphold the sacrosanct principles of the UN Charter in the Council, have yet again failed us. Looking the other way at a crucial moment concerning a fellow member state's sovereignty, territorial integrity, peace and security, and also for global peace and security, is not what we expect of Council members, given that they do not only represent their own delegation's interests in the Security Council, but the wider UN membership. Take a long, hard look at your respective actions and ask whether you deserve a seat at the peace table of the Security Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. I apologize. Now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran, Sayyid al-Rais.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, once again, the rostrum of the General Assembly is being manipulated flagrantly by some Western country for their own geopolitical interests. These countries are increasingly fostering polarization between UN member states. These countries used the request for this resumed special emergency session. They have used it to present a draft resolution to the General Assembly that's even more hostile towards the Russian Federation after having the 2 resolutions in the Security Council. Member states have not had the opportunity to introduce amendments to the draft resolution that we have before us today. This draft resolution constitutes clear proof that these countries purely want to take a hostile stance against the Russian Federation through an erroneous unidimensional view of what's happening. This hostile, provocative approach taken by these countries, this approach shows us that these countries are trying to fuel the conflict and to push to one side neo-Nazism in Ukraine rather than resolving issues through dialogue and negotiation. We condemn what the Western states are doing in the media and whipping things up against the Russian Federation. This includes fake information, false news, falsified images. So, trying to prevent the Russian Federation from taking steps to prevent the threats posed to its own people, which are upheld by the UN Charter. The UN Charter, sir, that was drafted 75 years ago by the founding fathers in good faith, over recent years has been exploited in a selective, erroneous way. This is through a double standards principle. Countries which are railing against the Russian Federation today and are criticizing it for wanting to protect its own border, those are the same countries that launched aggressive attacks against my country using the pretext of defending their national security, despite the fact that my country is tens of thousands of kilometers away and presented no threat to them whatsoever. The US and the countries of the so-called international coalition have destroyed whole towns. They've killed thousands of citizens, such as was the case in the town of Raqqa. Thus, these states have no right to shed any tears or to preach to anyone else because these states have no credibility whatsoever. Mr. President, I am sure you're aware that after the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russian Federation recognized the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Russian Federation extended its hand to its partners, including Ukraine. Ukraine should have respected the historical and geographical truths. The Kiev authorities should have abstained from taking measures and using reprisals against the Russians in the LPR, the DPR, and in Donetsk. They should have respected good neighborly relations. The Ukrainian authorities, after the 2014 coup, adopted negative, dangerous policies against their Russian neighbor. These policies have sought to denigrate everything that brought together the Ukrainian people. Political leaders and extremist political parties in Ukraine, with the support of the West, sought to warp the historic memory of the Ukrainian people. Extremist nationalist movements have used this situation to fuel animosity against the Russian Federation. Can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, that each and every day we hear some Western countries pontificate about the need to hold people responsible for particular events occurring? Nonetheless, these countries themselves say nothing against the movement of nationalists in Ukraine. It goes without saying that NATO states have been involved. They've played the role of instigator. They have provided numerous promises to nationalist extremist movements in Ukraine. They promised to incorporate Ukraine into NATO and the EU. They promised Ukraine military assistance if it upped its aggression against Russia. The US and its allies, including in NATO, have clearly instrumentalized these policies. They have covered up the inhuman discriminatory practices of the Kievan regime against the people of the DPR and the LPR and Russia-speaking people in the Donbass and elsewhere. These people over the past 8 years have suffered terribly. So these people finally chose liberation. They chose to become part of the Russian Federation. My country appreciates the Russian Federation's efforts to guarantee stability and security of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. Russia also is hosting tens of thousands of refugees, is providing humanitarian aid, and is opening up humanitarian corridors. It's also accepted that vessels containing grain and agricultural products leave Ukraine. My country will vote against the resolution on Ukraine proposed by Albania on this is resolution L5. Here, we're not talking about voting against transparency or the action of the GA. Rather, we want to understand the level of pressure exerted by Western countries against member states to highlight the animosity against the Russian Federation. This is why we reject this approach. We would caution other delegations against such trends. We would urge them to refuse these efforts to isolate Russia and to employ double standards. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Montenegro.
Mr. President, at the outset, Montenegro aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. However, I would like to further highlight several issues in my national capacity. We have gathered here today to shed the light once again on the importance of upholding the UN Charter and international law as the pillars of rule-based international order. International peace and security, the ground principles that gathered our predecessors to build the world back from the ashes and establish the United Nations, are most severely endangered. Arguably, to the extent never seen in the post-World War II period, due to unprovoked, unjustified, and premeditated war of aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. The fact that a permanent member of the Security Council and a nuclear state exercised a brutal force, breaching the territorial integrity and sovereignty of its neighboring country, should make everyone's blood run cold. The terror and crimes in Ukraine bring us to the dark era of brute force in international relations, factoring in solely the hard power as a way of promoting self-centered and self-obsessed national interest. Such assertive behavior challenges the liberal international order as we know it today, standing as a pivotal piece of the mosaic that guarantees equal rights of each country, along with the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms of all. Montenegro firmly rejects and most seriously condemns attempted illegal annexation by the Russian Federation of Ukraine's Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. We do not and will never recognize the illegal so-called referenda organized by the Russian Federation, nor their falsified and illegal results. Our position is clearly reflected in the joint statement of the Presidents of Central and Eastern European NATO member states on Russian attempts to illegally annex Ukrainian territories. We call on all states and international organizations to unequivocally reject this attempted illegal annexation. The brutality of Russian actions is clearly seen in the recent massive missile attacks against Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv. The terror and violence that people of Ukraine are exposed to must stop immediately. Perpetrators must not go unpunished for unleashing such brute force and for violating international peace and security. There can be no impunity for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other atrocity crimes. The people of Ukraine deserve justice. Mr. President, I join many of my colleagues who repeatedly pointed from this podium that an attack on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine is an attack on all of us, attack on principles and goals of the UN Charter, as well as our right to freely choose our own future. Russia will not stop at Ukraine. We have previously warned that malign activities of Russia and their proxies in the Western Balkans represent clear threat to the Western Balkans as well. Like in 2016, when the attempted coup d'etat was organized by members of the Russian intelligence services and others in the region, nowadays Montenegro is again subjected to Russian spying and other destabilizing malign activities against its sovereignty and democracy. The goal of this Russian harmful and hostile interference is to destabilize my country, thus undermining our European path. For the reason outlined, Montenegro co-sponsored and will vote in favor of the resolution and call others to do the same. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Montenegro, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, it is a difficult proposition to accept that might should be right. And as we meet once again in this assembly on the question of Ukraine and for the cause of peace, it is necessary to recall the relative stability of the present world, or the forged in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War, has been built upon our collective commitment to the Charter of the United Nations and our common respect for the rules of international law. Such commitment to the Charter and respect for international law, as is required of all peace-loving members of the United Nations, is not a passive responsibility, but an active duty, requiring our engagement in support of peace, especially in moments of great challenge. Today, the world is not in a good place, as my President, His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo, said to this assembly a few weeks ago. The war against Ukraine, which commenced on 24 February this year, has challenged our common principles and the purposes for coming together as a United Nations. Its further execution threatens to not only send us into the abyss of a possible nuclear confrontation, but also, through the present reason for our gathering, a disintegration of state entities in ways that could unravel many fragile state situations around the world. We therefore believe that we have a responsibility as members of this organization to help the parties come to the table of peace and keep the ship of global order on an even keel. That aspiration for peace cannot, however, be ad hoc or unilateral, but must rest upon the established principles of the Charter and international law. It must begin by an affirmation of the rights of all member states, no matter how small. It is in this context that Ghana reaffirms her full support for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and considers the referendum and subsequent annexation by the Russian Federation of the Ukrainian territories of Donbas, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia to be void and of no legal validity. We have said so in the 22nd and 30th September meetings of the Security Council, and repeat it here directly to all member states. In our principled position against the threat or use of force by any member state in the acquisition of state territory, we have not misunderstood the initial security concerns stated by the Russian Federation, nor its evolving raison d'etre offered for the war and the present annexation of territories. Those justifications are, however, matters that we believe should be addressed through the appropriate specific mechanisms, as nothing can justify a resort to war as an instrument for pursuing a state's relations with others. Indeed, that is why we cannot share the arguments some have sought to make by referring to unacceptable past actions by other member states in justifying the present unacceptable actions. Apart from the inappropriateness of using historical wrongdoing to justify present unacceptable actions, how can we tolerate the death and destruction being visited on an independent state that did not first seek the pursuit of war? Mr. President, in the face of the threats to our collective security, we must forge as an assembly a role for creating an environment that is conducive for diplomatic engagement, including confidence-building measures and constructive good faith dialogue between the parties. In this regard, we urge the parties to embrace the good offices of the Secretary General, whose impartial role in the ongoing aggression against Ukraine is geared towards the restoration of the authority of the Charter in the maintenance of international peace and security. We also request the parties to strongly consider the Pacific role that the International Court of Justice can bring in resolving aspects of the dispute in a way that can de-escalate the ongoing conflicts. States with influence on either party must also sustain their engagement for a settlement of the conflict. While the task of bringing an end to the war has so far proven difficult, we cannot give up. As the collective custodians of the peace of our world, we must take every necessary action to strengthen the present fragile order. That includes using these debates to send a clear, unified message of support for the Charter and international law, the basis for a stable international system. Not to do so would lead the world towards a historical path of division and an unsustainable situation for peace and progress. That would fly in the face of the aspirations of our populations for the resolution of the many complex and interrelated global challenges that demand strengthened multilateralism. We therefore urge good faith implementation of global actions to address the knock-on effects of the aggression against Ukraine. Besides addressing the food security situation, including sustaining and enhancing the Black Sea Grain Initiative and arrangements to facilitate the export of Russian fertilizers and agro-products to areas where they are critically required, there is the urgent need to address the destabilization of the energy and financial markets, which is taking a heavy toll on people, especially in developing economies. The well-being of our populations must compel us to chart bold and decisive solutions through dialogue and cooperation, as we face one of the most trying times of our generation. Mr. President, ultimately, however, the resolution of the challenges of food insecurity and the financial and energy crisis being experienced globally is linked to the just resolution of this unnecessary war. The barrel of the gun has proven no more than its ability to kill, maim, and cause harm. The war in Ukraine must therefore end now to save us counting any more losses. We stress the prioritization of civilian protection and strongly urge an immediate end to targeted attacks on civilian populated areas, civilian infrastructure, and critical infrastructure. We join others in calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and once again call on the Russian Federation to immediately and unconditionally, in line with its international obligations, withdraw its forces from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. In conclusion, I re-echo our call for a united front in pursuing peace and stability in Ukraine and bringing hope and restoration for its people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ghana, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President. In upholding full respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of all member states enshrined in the United Nations Charter, Cambodia has co-sponsored draft resolution A/ES/11/L5 and will vote in favor of the resolution. The forcible annexation of regions from a sovereign country is a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, which is not acceptable. In this regard, Cambodia urges that Ukraine's international recognized border must be fully respected. In ensuring the maintenance of international peace and security, it is indispensable that all member states shall fully adhere to the principle and value of this only truly universal global organization. Mr. President, since the war in Ukraine occurred in February, it has constituted enormous challenges to international peace and security and the world economy at large, in particular its negative impacts on food and energy security. The humanitarian consequences and suffering caused to the Ukrainian people are unimaginable. Cambodia joins with other delegations in calling all parties to resolve the conflict peacefully with all possible means through negotiation and diplomacy in order to find acceptable solution to the conflict in accordance with the United Nations Charters and international law. There will be no winner in this war. The only terrible thing that we will continue to see will be more human casualties, suffering, destruction, and threat to use nuclear weapons in the conflict, which are of great concern to all of us. Therefore, the best way forward is to end the war soonest, before it's too late. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President and dear colleagues, the Democratic Republic of the Congo will vote for the draft resolution as we did for the first three resolutions on Ukraine, based on our commitment to the principles of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as our respect for the Charter of the United Nations, all of which the Russian Federation has violated in Ukraine. They violated the independence, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and this should end. At the same time, we deplore the politics of double standards of the powerful of this world when it comes to Africa. While a lot of time, powerful of money and weapons have been spent on Ukraine during the last 8 months, very little attention is paid to my country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where over 7 million people have died as a result of aggression from neighboring countries. Give you just one example. Rwanda and Uganda invaded the DRC in 1998 and occupied large parts of eastern Congo until 2003. In 1999 and 2000, Rwanda and Uganda even confronted each other militarily in the city of Kisangani on 3 separate occasions. And this led to a lot of people being killed through stray bullets. Today, Rwanda continues to plunder the mineral and other natural resources of the DRC and occupies the city of Bunagana and several other locations in North Kivu province. For 24 years, the international community has not taken strong action against this aggression. No Security Council or General Assembly resolution has been adopted to impose sanctions on Rwanda. So we support Ukraine. We want to see the war ended, but we like to see the international community take similar action against other situations in the world where countries are being invaded and occupied. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Palau.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, colleagues, Palau aligns itself with the statement made by Fiji as chair of the Pacific Island Forum. We additionally make the following statement in our national capacity. It's been 8 months since the war in Ukraine started, and we're convening this emergency session against the backdrop of brutal missile attacks against civilian infrastructure and cities across Ukraine that have killed many innocent civilians. Palau strongly condemns these attacks and would like to remind us that indiscriminate attacks on innocent civilians are war crimes. Palau also condemns and unequivocally rejects the illegal attempted annexation by Russia of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, in addition to the autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We do not recognize the sham referenda that Russia uses to justify it. At the start of this emergency session, Russia attempted to blur transparency, then sow confusion into a democratic process, and when that didn't work, they attempted to silence healthy debate by member states before a historic vote. If we were all a bit confused at the onset of this session, one can only imagine how these referendums were conducted. In addition to witnessing the horrors of war in Ukraine, we've also felt the pangs of war in our own countries. Children and families are going hungry from food inflation. People are unable to get to work due to rising energy prices. In countries like ours, hotter than ever as a result of climate change, people are at times unable to cool themselves because our energy prices have shot through the roof. And in temperate countries, people, families, children will suffer from the bitter chill of winter because they will have no heat. And it goes on to show that in our increasingly globalized world, that we are one, and an attack on one of our member states is an attack on us all. And it is those who are the most vulnerable, those who have already felt the heavy beating of the COVID pandemic, get another hit to their lives without respite. Today, I'd like to tell you a story about an incredible individual I recently held the distinct pleasure of meeting, Louis Pugh. Louis swims in the most vulnerable ecosystems on Earth to call for their protection. He was the first to swim across the North Pole and the first to swim the full length of the English Channel to convince the UK to join the 30 by 30 initiative. In 2015, he took on the challenge of swimming in the Ross Sea in Antarctica in an attempt to convince Russia to sign on to the treaty to turn the Ross Sea into the world's largest marine protected area, an initiative that Russia had been the only holdout on for 5 years. And he did it in nothing but a Speedo, a swim cap, and goggles. On his experience of swimming in the Ross Sea, he quotes, "At negative 37 degrees Celsius, which is negative 37 degrees Fahrenheit, the air was so much colder than the freezing sea. Each time I lifted my arm out of the water into that air, it was a drop of more than 35 degrees Celsius. The pain in my arm was more excruciating than the burning agony I felt in the rest of my body. With each stroke, I watched myself freeze. After 100 meters, the first digits of my fingers were completely white. After 200 meters, the white had spread up to the second knuckle. At 300 meters, I couldn't feel my hands. I had undertaken the most southern swim in the world. On that day, my message about the desperate need to protect the Ross Sea came to life." Pugh then flew from Antarctica directly to Moscow and began a 2-year process of trying to convince the Kremlin to join the treaty. Because of his swim, he received widespread media attention in Russia and went on a highly publicized tour. He was then able to become friends with Russian hockey and legend and sports minister Slava Fedosov, and his message got through to the Kremlin and to Putin, who, after blocking the treaty for 5 years, signed on. When he received the phone call that Russia would sign the treaty, he said it was the happiest day of his life. His dedication had helped create the world's largest marine protected area. I tell this story because those of us who are fortunate enough to be here don't have to swim in sub-zero waters to reach the halls of power. But to enact change, we have to do things that are uncomfortable, to have the hard conversations, to push our leaders to act and attempt to broker peace, and do what we can so that our individual actions aggregate into a collective will that can't be ignored, because it is our collective energy that will shift the world. My call to action today is directed at the member states who have remained neutral, those who've chosen not to vote or to abstain. The reasons are varied. Some don't want to be embroiled in what's been touted as a geopolitical war of influence. Some have strong socioeconomic ties to Russia. Some have said that they want to remain neutral to allow Russia to be able to come back to dialogue. However, after 8 months of bloodshed, which has been escalating by the day, we all know that that's ever more unlikely. So Palau asks for your vote today in favor of the draft resolution to codify the promise that we don't live in an age where we allow countries to annex other countries through sham referendums, to uphold the basic principles of the UN Charter that govern relations between nations in the 21st century. That includes respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, the notion that nations don't simply redraw borders or make decisions at the expense of their neighbors because they are larger or more powerful. For those countries who are close friends with Russia, we say that in life, true friends are those who have the courage and conviction to tell you the truth, to urge you back on the right path when you've gone wrong, even when it's uncomfortable. Only through collective action can we change the trajectory of the war and allow the world to get back on the path to peace, not just for the benefit of Ukrainians, but also for those most vulnerable in all our countries who have been made to suffer as a result of China's aggression. It's often been said that moments that challenge us the most define us. What will be the legacy of the United Nations? The water will be cold, but let us all jump in. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Palau, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste.
Thank you, Mr. President. Timor-Leste joined other delegation in expressing its full support for the convening of this special emergency session on Ukraine. Mr. President, Ukraine is sovereign, independent, and a member of United Nations. We share the UN Secretary General views that any annexation of a state territory by another state resulting from threat or use of force is a violation of the principle of the UN Charter. It is our moral obligation to defend the sacred principle of sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. The supremacy of the international law must be upheld to ensure peace and stability. For Timor-Leste, to uphold the international rule-based order and the UN Charter is not an option. Indeed, it is a must. Mr. President, Timor-Leste is deeply concerned with the escalation of war in Ukraine. We have been witnesses for almost 8 months the killing of innocent people and the destruction of hundreds, if not thousands, of critical infrastructures and facilities in Ukraine, as well as the explosions of the Nord Stream 1 and the bridge that links Crimea and Russia. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, I quote, "When the rich make war, it's the poor that die." End of quote. Timor-Leste believes that the only way to settle the conflict is a true, genuine diplomatic solution in an amicable way, aiming at mutual benefit. The experience shows that war destroys communities and families and disrupts the social and economic development of nations, rather than generate peace and prosperity. Mr. President, Timor-Leste believes that peace is possible. We have to work on it and make it happen. The Russian Federation and Ukraine are brothers and neighbors. Mutual respect and understanding are prerequisites to create a peaceful coexistence. We, therefore, call upon all countries to help the two states to construct peace, to live peacefully, side by side, as good neighbors. Mr. President, to conclude, allow me to quote the statement of the President of the Republic of Timor-Leste delivered on 23rd of September 2022 during the high-level week in this August Assembly Hall. I quote, "Russia, Ukraine, and NATO's countries have to swallow their pride, review their past policies that led to this mutual suicide, back away from each other's borders. Let Ukrainians rebuild their country and their lives. Let Russians retreat with security to their borders." End of the quote. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Mr. President, We, the peoples of the United Nations, founded this organization to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Today, a permanent member of the Security Council with a particular responsibility to maintain international peace and security has brought the scourge back upon us all. Russia's playbook is simple. It denies its sovereign neighbor the very right to exist and has launched a war of aggression. Russia has seized land. To secure its land grab, Russia organized what it calls a referendum in several Ukrainian territories. Russia now threatened to keep the territories it illegally attempted to annex by any means necessary. It does not even shy away from nuclear threats against a country that has voluntarily given up its nuclear arsenal. Therefore, I am asking today, does the Russian government still subscribe to the declaration from January 3rd, 2022 by the leaders of all 5 nuclear weapon states, reaffirming the central principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought? Mr. President, today it is Ukraine, tomorrow it could be any of us. The sovereign equality and territorial integrity of any of us would be at the mercy of our neighbors or of whoever feels they have a territorial claim or a historical grievance. The sham referenda and Russia's illegal annexations are null and void. We are all under a legal obligation to refuse to recognize them, not now, not ever. The UN Charter is crystal clear. We have an obligation to settle international disputes by peaceful means. The resolution on the table recalls this obligation while reaffirming the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. On the 2nd of March 2022, 141 member states of this assembly voted in favor of resolution ES 11/1. By doing so, they voiced their strong support for the founding principles of the United Nations and called on Russia to stop this war. This was a great moment in the history of this noble assembly. Now is the time to stand by our principles and to show once again our passion and support for the UN Charter. Many UN member states have recently voiced their wish that this war be settled by means of diplomacy. This is reflected in the text of the draft resolution. We are grateful for the many valuable contributions to this text from across the globe. Mr. President, the United Nations Secretary General has been clear. Russia's annexations, and I quote, cannot be reconciled with the international legal framework. It stands against everything the international community is meant to stand for. It flouts the purposes and principles of the United Nations. It is a dangerous escalation. It has no place in the modern world. It must not be accepted. End of quote. Let us heed this call of the Secretary General. Let us stand by the UN Charter. Only a clear and principled commitment to the Charter can serve as a basis for future talks. I count on everyone to vote in favor of the resolution on the table. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance.
Excellencies, International IDEA continues to strongly condemn the unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine waged by the Russian Federation, violating the basic principles of the UN Charter that states that all member states shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. We reiterate to this Assembly that the war and the atrocities committed by Russia in Ukraine, a sovereign nation and a democracy, are in breach of international law, international agreements, the UN Charter, and the rules-based international order. International IDEA deplores the illegal and illegitimate holding of referendums in Ukraine's occupied territories on joining the Russian Federation. staged to imitate the pursuit of self-determination of people, they are an egregious abuse of this direct democracy tool by a hostile occupying power and an illegal attempt to modify the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. These referendums violate the Constitution of Ukraine, which states that the organization and procedure for conducting referendums are determined exclusively by the laws of Ukraine. They are conducted in gross violation of established principles of international humanitarian and human rights law. In the context of Russia's continued assault and ongoing occupation, the organization of a referendum aided or organized by occupying forces presumptively violates the Hague Regulations of 1907 and the Fourth Geneva Convention. In no circumstances can these referendums be considered as an exercise of a right to self-determination through remedial secession. International IDEA calls on the international community to condemn these referendums as illegitimate and illegal and not to recognize the forceful and illegal annexation of the territories by Russia. We also deplore Russia's use and abuse of the veto power in the UN Security Council, a body created to guarantee international peace and security, not to enable war and its perpetrators. The systematic abuse of veto powers in the Security Council calls for a profound reform of this body to ensure that it can truly uphold the principles of the UN Charter. We also wish to remind this Assembly that this conflict is not only about sovereignty, but also about democracy. The survival of democracy in Ukraine is not an add-on in the territorial defense of the country, but a fundamental aspect of it. Russia's war of aggression is also an attack on a democratic political system that securely places the destiny of the country in the hands of Ukrainian civilians and out of the reach of Russia. We therefore also urge those in this Assembly that will support Ukraine's reconstruction process to place democracy at its center. We reiterate our firm belief that international crisis should be addressed through the means of multilateral diplomacy and resolved on the basis of the principles of the UN Charter. We urge Russia to immediately end its full-scale unlawful invasion of Ukraine, and we demand the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all its military forces from Ukraine. We welcome the adoption and enforcement of sanctions by the international community against the Russian Federation until withdrawal of their forces from Ukraine and the full restoration of its territorial integrity. International IDEA will continue to do its part in collaboration with the United Nations, our member states, and other democratic governments and organizations to protect in Ukraine and elsewhere the principle that every country has a right to freely determine its own fate on the basis of the will of the people, freely expressed. Democracy's institutions and processes such as free and fair elections and democratic referenda are the best means to protect that right. They must not be manipulated for authoritarian purposes. Finally, we would like to use this opportunity to celebrate the award of the Nobel Peace Prize 2022 to the Ukrainian human rights organization Center for Civil Liberties and to human rights advocate Ales Bialatsky from Belarus and the Russian human rights organization Memorial. This award acknowledges the importance of civil society in resisting the authoritarian assault. It is also a way of stating that in this time and age, the quest for global peace, which is at the heart of the mission of this body, demands protecting democracy in Ukraine and elsewhere. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, we've heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.